And we're live. How's it going, everybody? I gotta move you back. The camera is way too close to my face. Here we go. Mucho bueno. Waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friend. Ha-ha! See, I knew people would show up if I started singing. People show up when I start singing, or people show up when I start drinking whiskey. It's been one of those days, man. I don't know who else is here. Angie's here. Who else is here watching me? Man, that light looks really funky, doesn't it? I added a new scarf to my ceiling. Adds kind of a reddish tint. My grandmother just sent me a message. Send to everyone, no matter what. How much you want to bet it's one of those chain messages. If you don't send this to 10 people, you're going to die on next Tuesday. Anyway, I don't plan on dying next Tuesday. I think we'll be fine. How about you? Alrighty then. My toesies are cold. Let's cover them up. Here we go. Alright, are we ready for another lovely reading session of Harry Potter? You'll give me a reddish tint, Angie? Oh, come on, let's go do this. Where's this reddish tint gonna be? Ooh, I can't talk about that. We're on, we're live to everybody. There's children in the room. We'll talk about that later. There's children in the room and your parents are watching. Oh my goodness, they don't need to know what we do in our free time. Alrighty, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 10, The Marauders Map. Yeah, my mind's there a little bit today. You're at Chesterfield again, Michelle. Is everybody listening to me again? Alright, I should have worn my Marauders Map. I actually have the Marauders Map in bandana form, and I washed it because I wore it the other day. So the Marauders Map. I need a Chesterfield Fire Department bandana. Can that be done? All right. I don't need gum while I'm reading because it distracts my mouth. All right. Bandana. Okay. Can everybody see me okay? Do I need to keep my bandana on for social distancing while we read? As a chief. Thank you, Rose. Michelle. Why the fuck would I just call you Rose? Whatever. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, anyway. So, get all the bubbles out of my mouth right now. Madame Pomfrey insisted on keeping Harry in the hospital wing for the rest of the weekend. He didn't argue or complain, but he wouldn't let her throw away the shattered remnants of his Nimbus 2000. He knew he was being stupid, knew that the Nimbus was beyond repair, but Harry couldn't help it. He felt as though he'd lost one of his best friends. He had a stream of visitors, all intent on cheering him up. Hagrid sent him a bunch of ear-wiggly flowers that looked like yellow cabbages, and Ginny Weasley, blushing furiously, turned up with a get-well card she'd made by herself, which rang shrilly unless Harry kept it shut under his bowl of fruit. That's adorable. The Gryffindor team visited again on Sunday morning, this time accompanied by Wood, who told Harry in a hollow, dead sort of voice that he didn't blame him in the slightest. Ron and Hermione only left Harry's bedside at night, but nothing anyone said or did could make Harry feel any better, because they only knew half of what was troubling him. Hi, Aunt Amber. He hadn't told anyone about the Grim, not even Ron and Hermione, because he knew Ron would panic and Hermione would scoff. The fact remained, however, that it had now happened twice, and both appearances had been followed by near-fatal accidents. The first time, he'd nearly been ran over by the night bus. The second time, fallen 50 feet from his broomstick. Was the Grim going to haunt him until he actually died? Was he going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the beast? And then there were the Dementors. Harry felt sick and humiliated every time he thought of them. Everyone said the Dementors were horrible, but no one else collapsed every time they went near one. No one else heard echoes in their head of their dying parents. How does he know? For Harry knew that screaming voices... who that screaming voice belonged to now. He had heard her words, heard them over and over again during the night hours in the hospital wing while he lay awake, staring at the strips of moonlight on the ceiling. When the Dementors approached him, he heard the last moments of his mother's life. Okay, guys, I need to point out that Mother's Day is this weekend, and while reading this, it makes me really want to say, Mom, I know you're not watching, but I seriously love you. Her attempts to protect him, Harry, from Voldemort, and Voldemort's laughter before he murdered her. Harry dozed fitfully, sinking into dreams full of clammy, rotted hands and petrified pleading, jerking awake only to dwell again on the sound of his mother's voice. It was a relief to return on Monday to the noise and bustle of the main school, where he was forced to think about other things, even if he had to endure Draco Malfoy's taunting. Malfoy was almost beside himself with glee at Gryffindor's defeat. He had finally taken off his bandages and celebrated having the full use of both arms again by doing spirited imitations, of Harry falling off his broom. Malfoy spent much of their next potions class doing Dementor imitations across the dungeon. Ron finally cracked, flinging a large, slippery crocodile heart at Malfoy, which hit him in the face and caused Snape to take 50 points from Gryffindor. If Snape's taking Defense Against the Dark Arts again, I'm going off sick, said Ron as they headed towards Lupin's classroom after lunch. Check who's in there, Hermione. Hermione peered around the classroom door. It's okay. Professor Lupin was back at work. It certainly looked as though he'd been ill. His old robes were hanging more loosely on him, and there were dark shadows beneath his eyes. Nevertheless, he smiled at the class as they took their seats, and they burst at once into an explosion of complaints about Snape's behavior while Lupin had been ill. It's not fair. He was only filling in. Why should he set us homework? We don't know anything about werewolves. 2 rolls of parchment. Did you tell Professor Snape that we haven't covered them yet? Lupin asked, frowning slightly. The babble broke out again. Yes, but he said we were really behind. He wouldn't listen. 2 rolls of parchment. Professor Lupin smiled at the look of indignation on every face. Don't worry. I'll speak to Professor Snape. You do not have to do the essay. Oh, no, said Hermione, looking very disappointed. I've already finished it. They had a very enjoyable lesson. Professor Lupin had brought along a glass box containing a hinky-punk, a little one-legged creature who seemed as though he was made of wisps of smoke, rather frail and harmless-looking. It lures travelers into bogs, said Professor Lupin as they took notes. You notice the lantern dangling from its hands? Okay, so guys, I don't know how much any of you know about folklore and stuff like that, but this hinky-punk sounds a lot like a will-o'-wisp. Will-o'-the-wisps. It hops ahead of people, and they follow the light, and then the hinky-punk made a horrible squelching noise against the glass. When the bell rang, everyone gathered on all their things and headed for the door, Harry amongst them. But, wait a moment, Harry, Lupin called. I'd like a word. I heard about the match, said Lupin, turning back to his desk and starting to pile books into his briefcase. I'm sorry about your broomstick. Is there any chance of fixing it? No, said Harry. The tree smashed it to bits. Lupin sighed. They planted the Whomping Willow the same year that I arrived at Hogwarts. People used to play a game, trying to get near enough to touch the trunk. In the end, a boy called Davy Gudgeon nearly lost an eye, and we were forbidden to go near it. No broomstick would have a chance. Did you hear about the Dementors, too? Said Harry with difficulty. Lupin looked at him quickly. Yes, I did. I don't think any of us have seen Professor Dumbledore that angry. They've been growing restless for some time, furious at his refusal to let them inside the grounds. I suppose they were the reason you fell? Yes, said Harry. He hesitated, and then the question he'd had to ask burst from him before he could stop himself. Why? Why do they attack me like that? Am I just... It has nothing to do with weakness, said Professor Lupin, as though he had read Harry's mind. The Dementors affect you worse than others because there are horrors in your past that the others don't have. A ray of wintry sunlight fell across the classroom, illuminating Lupin's gray hairs and the lines on his young face. Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk the earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Even muggles feel their presence, though they can't see them. Go too near a Dementor, and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. If it can, the Dementor will feed on you long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You'll be left with nothing but the worst experiences of your life, and the worst that has happened to you, Harry, is enough to make anyone fall off their broom. You have nothing to feel ashamed of. When they get near me, Harry stared at Lupin's desk, his throat tight. I can hear Voldemort murdering my mum. Lupin made a sudden motion with his arms, as though he made to grip Harry's shoulder, but thought better of it. There was a moment of silence, and then... Why did they have to come to the match? Said Harry bitterly. They're getting hungry, said Lupin coldly, shutting his briefcase with a snap. Dumbledore won't let them into the school, so their supply of human prey has dried up. I don't think they could resist the large crowd outside the Quidditch pitch. All that excitement, emotions running high, it was their idea of a feast. Azkaban must be terrible, Harry muttered. Lupin nodded grimly. The fortress is set on a tiny island way out to sea, but they don't need walls and water to keep the prisoners in, not when they're all trapped inside their own heads, incapable of a single cheerful thought. Most of them go mad within weeks. But Sirius Black escaped from them, Harry said slowly. He got away. Lupin's briefcase slipped from the desk. He had to stoop quickly to catch it. Yes, he said, straightening up. Black must have found a way to fight them. I wouldn't have believed it possible. Dementors are supposed to drain a witch or wizard of his powers if he is left with them for too long. You made the Dementors on the train back off, said Harry suddenly. There are certain defenses one can use, said Lupin. But there was only one Dementor on the train. The more there are, the more difficult it becomes to resist. What defenses? Said Harry at once. Can you teach me? I don't pretend to be an expert at fighting Dementors, Harry. Quite the contrary. But if the Dementors come to another Quidditch match, I need to be able to fight them. Lupin looked into Harry's determined face, hesitated, and then said, Well, all right, I'll try and help, but it'll have to wait until next term, I'm afraid. I have a lot to do before the holidays. I chose a very inconvenient time to fall ill. With the promise of anti-Dementor lessons from Lupin, the thought that he might never have to hear his mother's death again, and the fact that Ravenclaw flattened Hufflepuff in their Quidditch match at the end of November, Harry's mood took a definite upturn. Gryffindor were not out of the running after all, although they could not afford to lose another match. Wood became repossessed of his manic energy and worked his team as hard as ever in the chilly haze of rain that persisted into December. Harry saw no hint of a Dementor within the grounds. Dumbledore's anger seemed to be keeping them at their stations at the entrance. 2 weeks before the end of term, the sky lightened suddenly to a dazzling opaline white, and the muddy grounds were revealed one morning covered in glistening frost. Oh. I look cute. Inside the castle, there was a buzz of Christmas in the air. Who doesn't love Christmas? Thanks, Angie. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, had already decorated his classroom with shimmering lights that turned out to be real, fluttering fairies. The students were all happily discussing their plans for the holidays. Both Ron and Hermione had decided to remain at Hogwarts, and though Ron said it was because he couldn't stand 2 weeks with Percy, Hermione insisted she needed to use the library. Harry wasn't fooled. They were doing it to keep him company, and he was very grateful. To everyone's delight except Harry's, there was to be another Hogsmeade trip on the very last weekend of term. "We can do all our Christmas shopping there," said Hermione. "Mum and Dad would really love those tooth-flossing string mints from Honeydukes." Resigned to the fact that he would be the only third year staying behind again, Harry borrowed a copy of Witch Broomstick from Wood and decided to spend the day reading up on the different makes. He had been riding one of the school brooms at team practice, an ancient shooting star, which was very slow and jerky. He definitely needed a new broom of his own. On the Sunday morning of the Hogsmeade trip, Harry bid goodbye to Ron and Hermione, who were wrapped in cloaks and scarves, then turned up the marble staircase alone and headed towards Gryffindor Tower. Snow had started to fall outside the windows, and the castle was very still and quiet. "Psst! Harry!" He turned, halfway along the third-floor corridor, to see Fred and George peering at him from behind a statue of a humpbacked, one-eyed witch. "What are you doing?" said Harry curiously. "How come you're not going to Honeydukes?" "We've come to give you a bit of festive cheer before we go," said Fred with a mysterious wink. "Come in here." He nodded towards an empty classroom to the left of the one-eyed statue. Harry followed Fred and George inside. George closed the door quietly and then turned, beaming, to look at Harry. "Early Christmas present for you, Harry," he said. Fred pulled something from inside his cloak with a flourish and laid it on one of the desks. It was a large, square, very worn piece of parchment with nothing written on it. I feel like I need to get this. Hang on. I'm covered in blankets, guys. Look at my butt as I go. Alrighty then. The Marauders Map. I solemnly swear I'm up to no good. All right. Harry stared at it. What's that supposed to be? "This, Harry, is the secret to our success," said George, patting the parchment fondly. "It's a wrench giving it to you," said Fred, "but we decided last night your needs are greater than ours." "Anyway, we know it off by heart," said George. "We bequeath it to you. We don't need it anymore." "And what do I need with a bit of old parchment?" said Harry. "A bit of old parchment," said Fred, closing his eyes with a grimace, as though Harry had mortally offended him. "Explain, George." "Well, when we were in our first year, Harry, young, carefree, innocent." Harry snorted. He doubted whether Fred and George had ever been innocent. "Well, more innocent than we are now, we got into a spot of bother with Filch. We set off a dung bomb in the corridor, and it upset him for some reason. So he hauled us to his office and started threatening us with the usual detention, disembowelment, and we couldn't help noticing a drawer in one of his filing cabinets marked confiscated and highly dangerous. Don't tell me," said Harry, starting to grin. Well, what would you have done? Said Fred. George caused a diversion by dropping another dung bomb. I whipped the drawer open and grabbed this. It's not as bad as it sounds, you know, said George. We don't reckon Filch ever found out how it worked. He probably suspected what it was, though, or he wouldn't have confiscated it. But do you know how it works? Oh, yeah, said Fred, smirking. This little beauty's taught us more than any of the teachers at this school. You're winding me up, said Harry, looking at the ragged old bit of parchment. Oh, are we? Said George. He took out his wand, touched the parchment lightly, and said, I solemnly swear I'm up to no good. And at once, thin ink lines began to spread like a spider's web from the point that George's wand had touched. They joined each other, they crisscrossed, they fanned into every corner of the parchment, and then words began to blossom across the page, great curling green words that proclaimed, Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyor of aids to magical mischief makers, are proud to present the Marauders Map. It was a map showing every detail of Hogwarts Castle and grounds. But the truly remarkable thing was that the tiny ink dots moving around, each labeled with a name in minuscule writing. Astounded, Harry bent over it. A labeled dot at the top left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing his study. The caretaker's cat, Miss Norris, was prowling the second floor, and Peeves the poltergeist was currently bouncing around the trophy room. And as Harry's eyes traveled up and down the familiar corridor, he noticed something else. The map showed a set of passages he had never entered. Many of them seemed to lead right into Hogsmeade, said Fred, tracing one with his finger. There are 7 in all. 7. He pointed them out. But we're sure we're the only ones who know about these. Don't bother with the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor. We used it until last winter, but it's caved in, completely blocked. And we don't reckon anyone ever used this one, because the Whomping Willow's planted right over the entrance. But this one here, this one leads you right into the cellar of Honeydukes. We've used it loads of times. And, as you might have noticed, the entrance is right outside this room through that one-eyed old crone's hump. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, sighed George, patting the heading of the map. We owe them so much. Noble men, working tirelessly to help a new generation of lawbreakers, said Fred solemnly. Right, said George briskly. Don't forget to wipe it after you've used it, or anyone can read it, said Fred with warning. Tap it again and say, Mischief managed, and it'll go blank. So, young Harry, said Fred in an uncanny impersonation of Percy, mind you behave yourself. See you at Honeydukes, said George, winking. They left the room, both smirking in a satisfied sort of way. Harry stood there, gazing at the miraculous map. He watched the tiny ink Mrs. Norris turn left and pause to sniff something on the floor. If Filch really didn't know, he wouldn't have to pass the Dementors at all. But as soon as he stood there, flooded with excitement, something Harry had once heard Mr. Weasley say came floating out of his memory. Never trust anything that can think for itself, if you can't see where it keeps its brain. Smart. Never trust a computer. The map was one of those dangerous, magical objects that Mr. Weasley had been warning about. Aids to magical mischief. But then, Harry reasoned, he only wanted to use it to get into Hogsmeade. It wasn't as though he wanted to steal anything, or attack anyone. And Fred and George had been using it for years without anything horrible happening. Harry traced the secret passageway to Honeydukes with one finger. And then, quite suddenly, as though following orders, he rolled up the map, stuffed it in his robes, and hurried to the door of the classroom. Before I turn the page, Fred and George Weasley. I have a feeling that if I went to school with those two, I would have been best friends with them. They're my kind of people. Oh, look at that. Oh, can we see any of the names? I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, the handwriting's super, super small. But if anybody ever actually gets this book, it's the illustrated edition. It's amazing. But if you look really closely, it does actually list off names of where people are and stuff like that. It's kind of neat. The attention to detail is phenomenal. All right. Harry opened the door a couple of inches. There was no one outside. Very carefully, he edged out of the room and slipped behind the statue of the one-eyed witch. What did he have to do? He pulled out the map again and saw, to his astonishment, that a new ink figure had appeared upon it, labeled Harry Potter. This figure was standing exactly where the real Harry was standing, and about halfway down the third-floor corridor. Harry watched carefully. His little ink self appeared to be tapping the witch with his minute hand. Harry quickly took out his real wand and tapped the statue. Nothing happened. He looked back at the map. The tiniest speech bubble had appeared next to his figure. It gives you prompts, too. The word inside it said, Descendium. Descendium, Harry whispered, tapping the stone witch again. At once, the statue's hump opened wide enough to admit a fairly thin person. Harry glanced quickly up and down the corridor, and then tucked the map away again, hoisted himself into the hole head first, and pushed himself forward. He slid a considerable way down what felt like a stone slide, and then landed on cold, damp earth. He stood up and looked around. It was pitch dark. He held up his wand and muttered, Lumos, and saw that he was in a very narrow, low, earthy passageway. He raised the map, tapped it with the tip of his wand, and muttered, Mischief managed. The map went blank at once. He folded it carefully. There's light on my wall. Tucked it inside his robes, and then, heart beating fast, both excited and apprehensive, he set off. The passage twisted and turned, more like the burrow of a giant rabbit than anything else. Harry hurried along it, stumbling now and then on the uneven floor, holding his wand out in front of him. It took ages, but Harry had the thought of honeydukes to sustain him. After what felt like an hour, the passage began to rise. Panting, Harry sped up, his face hot, his feet very cold. 10 minutes later, he came to the foot of some worn stone steps which rose out of sight above him. Careful not to make any noise, Harry began to climb. 100 steps, 200 steps. He lost count as he climbed, watching his feet. And then, without warning, his head hit something hard. It seemed to be a trap door. Harry stood there, massaging the top of his head, listening. He couldn't hear any sounds above him. Ooh, that felt good. Very slowly, he pushed the trapdoor open and peered over the edge. He was in a cellar which was full of wooden crates and boxes. Harry climbed out of the trapdoor and replaced it. It blended so perfectly with the dusty floor that it was impossible to tell that it was there. Harry crept slowly toward the wooden staircase that led upstairs. Now he could definitely hear voices, not to mention the tinkling of a bell and the opening and shutting of a door. Wondering what he ought to do, he suddenly heard a door open much closer at hand. Somebody was about to come downstairs. I need to send a text real quick. Oh, I'll tell him in a minute. Wondering what he ought to do, he suddenly heard a door open much closer at hand. Somebody was about to come downstairs. And get another box of jelly slugs, dear. We're nearly cleaned out, said a woman's voice. A pair of feet was coming down the staircase. Harry leapt behind an enormous crate and waited for the footsteps to pass. He heard the man shifting boxes against the opposite wall. He might not get another chance. Quickly and silently, Harry dodged out from his hiding place and climbed the stairs, looking back. He saw an enormous backside and a shiny bald head buried in a box. Harry reached the door at the top of the stairs, slipped through it, and found himself behind the counter of honeydukes. He ducked, crept sideways, and then straightened up. Texting is not for losers, Angie. It's for texting my boss. He's wondering where the invoices went. The funny thing is, I told him that the invoices were being emailed to him. So he's got them all sitting in his email. Honeydukes was so crowded with Hogwarts students that no one looked twice at Harry. He edged amongst them, looking around, and suppressed a laugh as he imagined the look that would spread over Dudley's piggy face if he could see where Harry was now. There were shelves upon shelves of the most succulent-looking sweets imaginable. Creamy chunks of nougat, shimmering pink squares of coconut ice. God. Fat, honey-colored toffees, hundreds of different kinds of chocolates, all in neat rows. There was a large barrel of every flavored beans. Guys, I love Bertie Bott's every flavored beans. They're so good. And another of fizzing Whizbees, the levitating sherbet balls that Ron had mentioned. Along yet another wall were special effect sweets, Drooble's best blowing gum, which filled the room with bluebell-colored bubbles that refused to pop for days. The strange splintery tooth-flossing spring mints, tiny black pepper imps, breathe fire for your friends, ice mice, hear your teeth chatter and squeak. That would disturb the shit out of me. Peppermint cream shaped like toads, hop realistically in the stomach. Ugh. Fragile sugar-spun quills and exploding bonbons. Bonbons. Harry squeezed himself through a crowd of 6 years and saw a sign hanging in the furthest corner of the shop. Unusual tastes. Ron and Hermione were standing underneath, examining a tray of blood-flavored lollipops. Harry snuck up behind them. Ugh, no, Harry wouldn't want one of those. They're for vampires, I expect, Hermione was saying. How about these? Said Ron, shoving a jar of cockroach clustered under Hermione's nose. Definitely not, said Harry. Ron nearly dropped the jar. Harry! Squealed Hermione. What are you doing here? How did you... Wow, said Ron, looking very impressed. You learned to apparate! Course I haven't, said Harry. He dropped his voice so that none of the 6 years could hear him, and told them about the Marauders Map. How come Fred and George never gave it to me? Said Ron, outraged. I'm their brother! But Harry isn't going to keep it, said Hermione, as though the idea was ludicrous. He's going to hand it to Professor McGonagall. Aren't you, Harry? No, I'm not, said Harry. Are you mad? Said Ron, goggling at Hermione. Hand in something that good? If I hand it in, I'll have to say where I got it. Filch would know Fred and George nicked it. But what about Sirius Black? Hermione hissed. He could be using one of the passages on the map to get into the castle. The teachers have got to know. He can't be getting in through a passage, said Harry quickly. There are 7 secret tunnels on the map, right? Fred and George reckon Filch already knows about 4 of them. And the other 3, one of them's caved in, so no one's getting through that. One of them's got the Whomping Willow planted over the entrance, so you can't get out of it. And the one I just came through, well, it's really hard to see the entrance, so... the entrance to it down in the cellar, so unless he knew it was there... Harry hesitated. What if Black did know the passage was there? Ron, however, cleared his throat significantly and pointed to a notice pasted on the inside of the sweet shop door. By order of the Ministry of Magic, customers are reminded that until further notice, Dementors will be patrolling the streets of Hogsmeade every night after sundown. This measure has been put in place for the safety of Hogsmeade's residents and will be lifted upon the capture of Sirius Black. It is therefore advisable that you complete your shopping well before nightfall. Merry Christmas. See, said Ron quietly, I'd like to see Black try and break into Honeydukes with Dementors swarming all over the village. Anyway, Hermione, the Honeydukes owners would hear a break-in, wouldn't they? They live over the shop. Yes, but... Hermione seemed to be struggling to find another problem. Look, Harry, you still shouldn't be coming into Hogsmeade. He hasn't got a signed form. If anyone finds out, he'll be in so much trouble. And it's not nightfall yet. What if Sirius Black turns up today? Now! He'll have a job spotting Harry in this, said Ron, nodding through the mullioned windows at the thick, swirling snow. Come on, Hermione. It's Christmas. Harry deserves a break. No pictures on that page. Hermione bit her lip, looking extremely worried. Are you going to report me? Harry asked her, grinning. Of course not. But honestly, Harry. See the fizzing Whizbees, Harry? Said Ron, grabbing him and leading him over to the barrel. And the jelly slugs? And the acid pops? Fred gave me one of those when I was 7. It burnt a hole right through my tongue. I remember Mom walloping him with her broomstick. Ron stared broadly at the acid pop box, broodingly. Reckon Fred'll take a bit of cockroach clusters if I told him they were peanuts? When Ron and Hermione had paid for their sweets, and the 3 of them left Honeydukes for the blizzard outside. When they had paid for their sweets, they left for the blizzard outside. Hogsmeade looked like a Christmas card, and the little thatched cottages and shops were all covered in a layer of crisp snow. There were holly wreaths on the doors and strings of enchanted candles hanging in the trees. Harry shivered. Unlike the other 2, he didn't have his cloak. They headed up the street, heads bowed against the wind, Ron and Hermione shouting through their scarves. That's the post office! Zonko's is up there! We can go up to the Shrieking Shack! Tell you what, said Ron, his teeth chattering. Shall we go for a butterbeer at the 3 Broomsticks? Harry was more than willing. The wind was fierce and his hands were freezing. So they crossed the road. In a few minutes, they were entering the tiny inn. It was extremely crowded, noisy, warm, and smoky. A curvy sort of woman with a pretty face was serving a bunch of rowdy warlocks at the bar. That's Madame Rose Myrta, said Ron. I'll get the drinks, shall I? He added, going slightly red. Harry and Hermione made their way to the back of the room, where there was a small vacant table between the window and a handsome Christmas tree which stood next to the fireplace. Ron came back 5 minutes later, carrying 3 foaming tankards of hot butterbeer. Happy Christmas, he said happily, raising his tankard. Harry drank deeply. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, and seemed to heat every bit of him from the inside. A sudden breeze ruffled his hair. The door of the 3 Broomsticks had opened again. Harry looked over the rim of his tankard and choked. All right, I'll show you this side first. They're hanging out in the corner. And there's the front door. Can we guess who entered Hogsmeade? Professor McGonagall and Flitwick had just entered the pub in a flurry of snowflakes, shortly followed by Hagrid, who was deep in conversation with a portly man in a lime green bowler hat and a pinstriped cloak. Cornelius Fudge, Minister of Magic. In an instant, Ron and Hermione had both placed hands on the top of Harry's head and forced him off his stool and under the table. Dripping with butterbeer and crouching out of sight, Harry clutched his empty tankard and watched the teachers and Fudge's feet move towards the bar, paused, and then turned and walked right towards him. Somewhere above him, Hermione whispered, Mobilaribus. Mobilaribus? Okay, that makes sense. The Christmas tree beside their table rose a few inches off the ground, drifted sideways, and landed with a soft thump right in front of their table, hiding them from view. Staring through the dense lower branches, Harry saw 4 sets of chair legs move back from their table right beside theirs, and then heard the grunts and sighs of the teachers and ministers as they sat down. By the way, guys, I'm collecting Christmas trees, like fake Christmas trees. If anybody has some in this area, let me know. Next, he saw another pair of feet wearing sparkly turquoise high heels and heard a woman's voice. A small gilly water? Me, said Professor McGonagall. 4 pints of mulled mead? Ta, Rose Myrta, said Hagrid. A cherry syrup and soda with ice and umbrella? Said Professor Flitwick, smacking his lips. And you'll be the red currant rum, Minister. Thank you, Rose Myrta, dear, said Fudge's voice. Lovely to see you again, I must say. Have one yourself, won't you? Come and join us. Well, thank you very much, Minister. Harry watched the glittering heels march away and back again. His heart was pounding uncomfortably in his throat. Why hadn't it occurred to him that this was the last weekend of term for the teachers, too? And how long were they going to sit there? He needed time to sneak back into Honeyduke's if he wanted to return to school tonight. Hermione's leg gave a nervous twitch next to him. "So what brings you to this neck of the woods, Minister?" said Madame Rosemerta's voice. Harry saw the lower part of Fudge's thick body twist in his chair as though he was checking for eavesdroppers. And then he said in a quiet voice, "What else, my dear, but Sirius Black? I dare say you heard what happened up at the school on Halloween." "I did hear a rumor," admitted Madame Rosemerta. "Did you tell the whole pub?" said Professor McGonagall exasperatedly. "Do you think Black's still in the area, Minister?" whispered Madame Rosemerta. "I'm sure of it," said Fudge shortly. Did you know that the Dementors have searched my pub twice?" said Madame Rosemerta, a slight edge to her voice. "Scared all of my customers away. It's very bad for business, Minister." "Rosemerta, dear, I don't like them any more than you do," said Fudge uncomfortably. "Necessary precaution. Unfortunate, but there you are. I've just met some of them. They're in a fury about Dumbledore, that he won't let them inside the castle grounds." "I should think not," said Professor McGonagall sharply. "How are we supposed to teach with those horrors floating around?" "Hear, hear," squeaked tiny Professor Flitwick, whose feet were dangling a foot from the ground. "All the same," demurred Fudge, "they are here to protect you all from something much worse. We all know what Black's capable of." "Do you know, I still have trouble believing it," said Madame Rosemerta thoughtfully. "Of all the people to go over to the dark side, Sirius Black was the last I'd have thought. I mean, I remember him when he was a boy at Hogwarts. If you'd have told me what he was going to become, I'd have said you had too much mead." "You don't know the half of it, Rosemerta," said Fudge gruffly. "The worst he did isn't widely known." "Hey, David." "The worst?" said Madame Rosemerta, her voice alive with curiosity. "Worse than murdering all those poor people, you mean?" "I certainly do," said Fudge. "I don't believe it. What could possibly be worse?" "You say you remember him at Hogwarts, Rosemerta," murmured Professor McGonagall. "Do you remember who his best friend was?" "Naturally," said Madame Rosemerta with a small laugh. "Never saw one without the other, did you? The number of times I had them in here. They used to make me laugh. Quite the double act, Sirius Black and James Potter." Harry dropped his tankard with a loud clunk. Ron kicked him. "Precisely," said Professor McGonagall. "Black and Potter. Ringleaders of their little gang. Both very bright, of course. Exceptionally bright, in fact. But I don't think we've ever had such a pair of troublemakers." "I don't know," chuckled Hagrid. "Fred and George Weasley could give 'em a run for their money." "You'd have thought Black and Potter were brothers," chimed Professor Flitwick. "Inseparable." "Of course they were," said Fudge. "Potter trusted Black beyond all his other friends. Nothing changed when they left school. Black was best man when James married Lily. Then they named him godfather to Harry. Harry has no idea, of course. You can imagine how the idea would torment him." "Because Black turned out to be in league with you-know-who?" whispered Madame Rosemerta. "Worse than that, my dear." Fudge dropped his voice and proceeded in a sort of low rumble. "Not many people are aware that the Potters knew you-know-who was after them. Dumbledore, who of course worked tirelessly against you-know-who, had a number of useful spies. One of them tipped him off, and he alerted Lily and James at once. He advised them to go into hiding. Well, of course, you-know-who wasn't an easy person to hide from. Dumbledore told them that their best chance was the Fidelius charm." "How does that work?" said Madame Rosemerta, breathless with interest. Professor Flitwick cleared his throat. "An immensely complex spell," he said squeakily, "involving the magical concealment of a secret inside a single living soul. The information is hidden inside the chosen person, or secret keeper, and is henceforth impossible to find, unless, of course, the secret keeper chooses to divulge it. As long as the secret keeper refuses to speak, you-know-who could search the village where Lily and James were staying for years and never find them. not even if he had his nose pressed against their sitting-room window. Ooh, that was squeaky. So Black was the Potter's secret keeper, whispered Madame Rosemerta. Naturally, said Professor McGonagall. James Potter told Dumbledore that Black would rather die than tell him where they were. But Black was planning to go into hiding himself, and yet Dumbledore remained worried. I remember him offering to be the Potter's secret keeper himself. He suspected Black? Gasped Madame Rosemerta. He was sure that somebody close to the Potters had been keeping you-know-who informed of their movements, said Professor McGonagall darkly. Indeed, he had suspected for some time that someone on our side had turned traitor and was passing a lot of information to you-know-who. But James insisted on using Black? He did, said Fudge heavily. And then, barely a week after the Fidelius charm had been performed, Black betrayed them, breathed Madame Rosemerta. He did indeed. Black was tired of his double agent role. He was ready to declare his support openly for you-know-who, and he seemed to have planned this from the moment of the Potter's death. But as we all know, you-know-who met his downfall in little Harry Potter. Powers gone, horribly weakened, he fled, and this left Black in a very nasty position indeed. His master had fallen at the moment when he, Black, had shown his true colors as a traitor. He had no choice but to run for it. Filthy, stinking turncoat, Hagrid said so loudly that half the bar went quiet. Shh, said Professor McGonagall. I met him, growled Hagrid. I must have been the last to see him before he killed all them people. It was me that rescued Harry from Lily and James' house after they were killed. Just got him out of the ruins, poor little thing, with a great slash across his forehead and his parents dead, and Sirius Black turns up in that flying motorcycle he used to ride. Never occurred to me what he was doing there. Didn't know he'd been Lily and James's secret keeper. Thought he'd just heard the news of you-know-who's attack and come to see what he could do. White and shaken he was, and you know what I did? I comforted the murdering traitor, Hagrid roared. Hagrid, please, said Professor McGonagall, keep your voice down. How was I to know he wasn't upset about Lily and James? It was you-know-who he cared about. And then he says, give Harry to me, Hagrid. I'm his godfather. I'll look after him. Ha! But I had me orders from Dumbledore, and I told Black no. Dumbledore said Harry was to go to his aunt and uncle. Black argued, but in the end he gave in. Told me to take his motorbike to get Harry there. I won't be needing it any more, he says. I should have known there was something fishy going on. He loved that motorcycle. Why was he giving it to me for? Why wouldn't he need it any more? Fact was, it was too easy to trace. Dumbledore knew he'd been the Potter's secret keeper. Black knew he was going to have to run for it. Knew it was a matter of hours before the Ministry was after him. But what if I'd given Harry to him, eh? I bet he'd have pitched him off the bike halfway out to sea, his best friend's son. But when a wizard goes over to the dark side, there's nothing and no one that matters to him anymore. A long silence followed Hagrid's story, and then Madame Rosemerta said with some satisfaction, but he didn't manage to disappear, did he? The Ministry of Magic caught up with him the next day. Alas, if only we had. Oh my God, my leg. Said Fudge bitterly. It was not we who found him. It was little Peter Pettigrew, another of the Potter's friends. Maddened by grief, no doubt, and knowing that Black had been the Potter's secret keeper, he went after Black himself. Pettigrew? That fat little boy who was always tagging around after them at Hogwarts, said Madame Rosemerta. Hero worshipped Black and Potter, said Professor McGonagall. Never quite in their league, talent-wise. I was often rather sharp with him. You can imagine how I regret that now. She sounded as though she had a sudden head cold. There now, Minerva, said Fudge kindly. Pettigrew died a hero's death. Eyewitnesses, muggles of course, we wiped the memories later, told us how Pettigrew cornered Black. They say he was sobbing, Lily and James, Sirius, how could you? and then he went for his wand. Well, of course, Black was quicker. Blew Pettigrew to smithereens. Professor McGonagall blew her nose and said thickly, "Stupid boy, foolish boy. He was always hopeless at dueling. Should have left it to the ministry." "I tell you, if I got to Black before little Pettigrew did, I wouldn't have messed around with wands. I'd have ripped him limb from limb," Hagrid growled. "You don't know what you're talking about, Hagrid," said Fudge sharply. "Nobody but a trained hit wizard from the magical law enforcement squad would have stood up a chance against Black once he was cornered. I was junior minister in the Department of Magical Catastrophes at the time, and I was one of the first on the scene after Black murdered all those people. I will never forget it. I still dream about it sometimes. A crater in the middle of the street, so deep it had cracked the sewer below. Bodies everywhere. Muggles screaming, and Black standing there laughing, with what was left of Pettigrew in front of him. A heap of blood-stained robes, few fragments." Fudge's voice stopped abruptly. There was a sound of 5 noses being blown. "Well, there you have it, Rosmerta," said Fudge sickly. "Black was taken away by 20 members of the Magical Law Enforcement Patrol, and Pettigrew received the Order of Merlin First Class, which I think was some comfort to his poor mother. Black's been in Azkaban ever since." Madame Rosmerta let out a long sigh. "Is it true that he's mad, Minister?" "I wish I could say he was," said Fudge slowly. "I certain believe his master's defeat unhinged him for a while. The murder of Pettigrew and all those muggles was the action of a cornered and desperate man. Cruel, pointless. Yet I met Black on my last inspection of Azkaban. You know, most of the prisoners in there sit muttering to themselves in the dark. There's no sense in them. But I was shocked at how normal Black seemed. He spoke quite rationally to me. It was unnerving. You'd have thought he was merely bored. Asked if I'd finished with my newspaper, cool as you please. Said he missed doing the crosswords. Yes, I was astounded at how little effect the Dementors seemed to be having on him. And he was one of the most heavily guarded in the place. You know, Dementors outside his door, day and night." "But what do you think he's broken out to do?" said Madame Rosmerta. "Good gracious, Minister, you don't think he's trying to rejoin you-know-who, is he?" "I dare say that he is. Or, that's his eventual plan," said Fudge evasively. "But we hope to catch Black long before that. I must say, you-know-who alone and friendless is one thing, but give him back his most devoted servant, and I shudder to think how quickly he'll rise again." There was a small chink of glass on wood. Someone had set down their glass. "You know, Cornelius, if you're dining with the headmaster, we'd better head back up to the castle," said Professor McGonagall. One by one, the pairs of feet in front of Harry took the weight of their owners once more. Hems of cloaks swung into sight, and Madame Rosmerta's glistening heels disappeared behind the bar. The door of the 3 broomsticks opened again. There was another flurry of snow, and the teachers disappeared. "Harry?" Ron and Hermione's faces appeared under the table. They were both staring at Harry, lost for words. Chapter 11. The Firebolt. My knife was digging into my hip. I need another shot of whiskey, guys! Maybe not a full shot. Harry did not have a clear idea of how he had managed to get back into the Honeyduke cellar, through the tunnel, and into the castle once more. All he knew was that the return trip seemed to take no time at all, and that he hardly noticed what he was doing, because his head was still pounding with the conversation he had just heard. Why had nobody ever told him? Dumbledore, Hagrid, Mr. Weasley, Cornelius Fudge? Why hadn't anyone ever mentioned the fact that Harry's parents had died because of their best friend, betraying them. Ron and Hermione watched Harry nervously all through dinner, not daring to talk about what they'd overheard, because Percy was sitting close by them. When they went upstairs to the crowded common room, it was to find Fred and George had set off half a dozen dunk bombs in a fit of end-of-term high spirits. Harry, who didn't want Fred and George asking him whether he'd reached Hogsmeade or not, snuck quietly up to the empty dormitory and headed straight for his bedside cabinet. He pushed his books aside and quickly found what he was looking for. The leather-bound photo album Hagrid had given him 2 years ago, which was full of wizard pictures of his mother and father. He sat down on the bed, drew the hangings around him, and started turning the pages, searching, until he stopped at the picture of his parents' wedding day. There was his father, waving at him, beaming, the untidy black hair Harry had inherited standing up in all directions, and there was his mother, alight with happiness, one arm around his dad. And that must be him, their best man. Harry had never given him a thought before. If he hadn't known it was the same person, he would never have guessed it was black in this old photograph. His face wasn't sunken and waxy, but handsome, full of laughter. Had he already been working for Voldemort when this picture was taken? Was he already planning the deaths of the 2 people next to him? Did he realize he was facing 12 years in Azkaban? 12 years which would make him unrecognizable? But the Dementors didn't affect him, Harry thought, staring at the handsome, laughing face. He doesn't have to hear my mom screaming if they get too close. Harry slammed the album shut, reached over and stuffed it back into his cabinet, took off his robes and glasses, and got into bed, making sure the hangings were hiding him from view. The dormitory door opened. "Harry?" said Ron's voice uncertainly, but Harry lay still, pretending to be asleep. He heard Ron leave again and rolled over on his back, his eyes wide open. A hatred such as he had never known before was coursing through Harry like poison. He could see Black laughing at him through the darkness, as though somebody had pasted the picture from the album over his eyes. He watched as though somebody was playing him a piece of a film. Sirius Black plastering Peter Pettigrew, who resembled Neville Longbottom, blasting Peter Pettigrew, who resembled Neville Longbottom, into 1,000 pieces. He could hear, though he had no idea what Black's voice might sound like, a low, excited mutter. "It has happened, my lord. The Potters have made me their secret keeper." And then came another voice, laughing shrilly, the same laugh that Harry heard inside his head whenever the Dementors drew near. "Harry, you look terrible." Harry couldn't get to sleep until daybreak. He had woken to find the dormitory deserted, dressed, and gone down the spiral staircase to a common room that was completely empty except for Ron, who was eating a peppermint toad and massaging his stomach, and Hermione, who had spread her homework out over 3 tables. Sounds like me. "Where is everyone?" said Harry. "Gone. It's the first day of the holidays, remember?" said Ron, watching Harry closely. "It's nearly lunchtime. I was going to come and wake you in a minute." Harry slumped into a chair next to the fire. Snow was still falling outside the windows. Crookshanks was spread out in front of the fire like a large ginger rug. "You really don't look well, you know," Hermione said, peering anxiously into his face. "I'm fine," said Harry. "Harry, listen," said Hermione, exchanging a look with Ron. "You must be really upset about what we heard yesterday, but the thing is, you mustn't go doing anything stupid." "Like what?" said Harry. "Like trying to go after Black," said Ron sharply. Harry could tell they had rehearsed this conversation while he'd been asleep. He didn't say anything. "You won't, will you, Harry?" said Hermione. "Because Black's not worth dying for," said Ron. Harry looked at them. They didn't seem to understand at all. "Do you know what I see and hear every time a Dementor gets too near me?" Ron and Hermione shook their heads, looking apprehensive. "I can hear my mum screaming and pleading with Voldemort. And if you heard your mum screaming like that, just about to be killed, you wouldn't forget it in a hurry. And if you found out someone who was supposed to be a friend of hers had betrayed her and sent Voldemort after her, There's nothing you can do, said Hermione, looking stricken. The Dementors will catch Black, and he'll go back to Azkaban and serve him right. You heard what Black said. You heard what Fudge said. Black isn't affected by Azkaban like normal people are. It's not a punishment for him like it is for the others. What are you saying? Said Ron, looking very tense. You want to kill Black or something? Don't be silly, said Hermione in a panicky voice. Harry doesn't want to kill anyone. Do you, Harry? Again, Harry didn't answer. He didn't know what he wanted to do. All he knew was that the idea of doing nothing, while Black was at liberty, was almost more than he could stand. Malfoy knows, he said abruptly. Remember what he said to me in Potions? If it was me, I'd hunt him down myself. I'd want revenge. You're going to take Malfoy's advice instead of ours? Said Ron furiously. Listen, you know what Pettigrew's mother got back after Black finished with him? Dad told me. The Order of Merlin, first class, and Pettigrew's finger in a box. That was the biggest bit of him they could find. Black's a madman, Harry, and he's dangerous. Malfoy's dad must have told him, said Harry, ignoring Ron. He was right in Voldemort's inner circle. Say you know who, will you? Interrupted Ron angrily. So obviously the Malfoys knew Black was working for Voldemort. And Malfoy'd love to see you blown into a million pieces like Pettigrew. Get a grip. Malfoy's just hoping you'll get yourself killed before he has to play you at Quidditch. Harry, please, said Hermione, her eyes now shining with tears. Please, be sensible. Black did a terrible, terrible thing, but don't put yourself in danger. It's what Black wants. Oh, Harry, you'd be playing right into Black's hands if you went looking for him. Your mum and dad wouldn't want you to get hurt, would they? They'd never want you to go looking for Black. Okay. I think they're walking down to Hagrid's hut. Maybe that's Hagrid's hut down there. It's the only thing I could think of. I'll never know what they wanted. Because, thanks to Black, I've never spoken to them, said Harry shortly. There was silence, in which Crookshanks stretched luxuriously, flexing his clogs. Ron's pocket quivered. Look, said Ron, obviously casting around for a change of subject. It's the holidays. It's nearly Christmas. Let's go down and see Hagrid. We haven't visited him for ages. No, said Hermione quickly. Harry isn't to leave the castle, Ron. Yeah, let's go, said Harry, sitting up. And I can ask him how come he never mentioned Black when he told me about my parents. Further discussion of Sirius Black plainly wasn't what Ron had had in mind. Or we could have a game of chess, he said hastily. Or gobstones. Percy left a set. No, let's visit Hagrid, said Harry firmly. So they got their cloaks from the dormitories and set off through the portrait hole. Stand and fight, you yelly-bellied mongrels! Down through the empty castle and out through the oak front doors. They made their way slowly down the lawn, making a shallow trench in the glistening, powdery snow, their socks and the hems of their cloaks soaked and freezing. The forbidden forest looked as though it had been enchanted, each tree smattered with silver, and Hagrid's cabin looked like an iced cake. Ron knocked, and there was no answer. He's not out, is he? Said Hermione, who was shivering under her cloak. Ron had his ear to the door. There's a weird noise, he said. Listen, is that Fang? Harry and Hermione put their ears to the door. From inside the cabin came a series of low, throbbing moans. Think we better go and get someone? said Ron nervously. Hagrid! Called Harry, thumping the door. Hagrid, are you in there? The sound of heavy footsteps, then the door cracked open. Hagrid stood there, his eyes red and swollen, tears splashing down the front of his leather waistcoat. You've heard, he howled, and then he flung himself into Harry's neck. Hagrid, being at least twice the size of a normal man, this was no laughing matter. Harry, about to collapse under Hagrid's weight, was rescued by Ron and Hermione, who each seized Hagrid under the arm and heaved him, Harry helping, back into the cabin. Hagrid allowed himself to be steered into a chair and slumped over the table, sobbing uncontrollably. his face glistening with tears which dripped down his tangled beard. "Hagrid, what is it?" said Hermione, aghast. Harry spotted an official-looking letter lying open on the table. "What's this, Hagrid?" Hagrid's sobs redoubled, and then he shoved the letter towards Harry, who picked it up and read aloud. "Dear Mr. Hagrid, further to our inquiry into the attack by a Hufflepuff on a student in your class, we have accepted the assurances of Professor Dumbledore that you bear no responsibility for the regrettable incident." "Well, that's okay then, Hagrid," said Ron, clapping Hagrid on the shoulder. But Hagrid continued to sob and waved one of his gigantic hands, inviting Harry to read on. "However, we must register our concern about the hippogriff in question. We have decided to uphold the official complaint of Mr. Lucius Malfoy, and this matter will therefore be taken to the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. The hearing will take place on April 20th, and we ask you to present yourself and the hippogriff at the committee's office in London on this date. In the meantime, the hippogriff should be kept tethered and isolated. Yours in fellowship." And there was a list of school governors. "Oh," said Ron. "But you said Buckbeak isn't a bad hippogriff, Hagrid. I bet he'll get off." "You don't know them gargoyles at the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures," choked Hagrid, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "They got it in for interesting creatures." A sudden sound from the corner of Hagrid's cabin made Harry, Ron, and Hermione whip around. Buckbeak, the hippogriff, was lying in the corner, chomping on something that was oozing blood all over the floor. "I couldn't leave him out there in the snow," choked Hagrid, "all on his own at Christmas." I'm trying to cry. It's not working. Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked at each other. They had never seen eye to eye with Hagrid about what he called interesting creatures, and other people called terrifying monsters. On the other hand, there didn't seem to be anything particularly harmful in Buckbeak. In fact, by Hagrid's usual standards, he was positively cute. "You'll have to put up a good strong defense, Hagrid," said Hermione, sitting down and laying a hand on Hagrid's massive forearm. "I'm sure you can prove Buckbeak is safe." "Oh, make no difference," sobbed Hagrid. "Them disposal devils, they're all in Lucius Malfoy's pocket, scared of him. And if I lose the cake, Buckbeak—" Hagrid drew his finger swiftly across his throat, and then gave a great wail and lurched forward, his face in his arms. "What about Dumbledore, Hagrid?" said Harry. "He done more'n enough for me already," groaned Hagrid. "Good enough on his plate about keeping them Dementors out of the castle and Sirius Black lurking round." Ron and Hermione looked quickly at Harry as though expecting him to start berating Hagrid for not telling the truth about Black. But Harry couldn't bring himself to do it. Not now that he saw Hagrid so miserable and scared. "Listen, Hagrid," he said. "You can't give up. Hermione's right. You don't need a good defense. You can call us as witnesses." "I'm sure I've read about a case of hippogriff baiting," said Hermione thoughtfully, "where the hippogriff got off. I'll look it up for you, Hagrid, and see exactly what happened." I kind of look like Hermione today. I also need to dye my hair again. Hagrid howled loudly. Harry and Hermione looked at Ron to help them. Shall I make a cup of tea?" said Ron. Harry stared at him. "What? It's what my mom does whenever someone's upset," Ron muttered, shrugging. At last, after many assurances of help, with a steaming mug of tea in front of him, Hagrid blew his nose on a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth and said, "You're right. I can't afford to go to pieces. Gotta pull myself together." Fang, the boarhound, came timidly out from under the table and laid his head on Hagrid's knee. "I not been myself lately," said Hagrid, stroking Fang with one hand and mopping his face with the other. "Worried about Buckbeak and no one liking me classes." "We do like them," lied Hermione at once. "Yeah, they're great," said Ron, crossing his fingers on the table. "How are the flubberworms?" "Dead," said Hagrid gloomily. "Too much lettuce." "Oh, no," said Ron, his lip twitching. And them Dementors make me feel really terrible and all, said Hagrid with a sudden shudder. Gotta walk past 'em every time I want a drink at the Three Broomsticks. It's like being back in Azkaban. He fell silent, gulping his tea. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched him breathlessly. They had never heard Hagrid talk about his brief spell in Azkaban before. After a brief pause, Hermione said timidly, Is it awful in there, Hagrid? You've no idea, said Hagrid quietly. Never been anywhere like it. Thought I was going mad. Kept going over horrible stuff in me head. The day I got expelled from Hogwarts, the day my dad died, the day I had to let Norbert go. His eyes filled with tears. Norbert was the baby dragon Hagrid had once won in a game of cards. You can't really remember who you are after a while, and you can't see no point in living at all. I used to hope I'd just die in me sleep. When they let me out, it was like being born again. Everything came flooding back in. It was the best feeling in the world. Mind, the Dementors weren't keen on letting me go. But you were innocent, said Hermione. Hagrid snorted. You think that matters to him? To them? They don't care. As long as you got a couple hundred humans stuck in there with him, they can leech all the happiness out of him. They don't know who's guilty and who's not. Other leg went to sleep. Hagrid went quiet for a moment, staring into his tea, and then he said quickly, Thought of just letting Buckbeak go, trying to make him fly away, but how do you explain to a hippogriff it's got to go into hiding? And I'm scared of breaking the law. He looked at them, tears streaking down his face. I don't ever want to go back to Azkaban. The trip to Hagrid's, though far from fun, had nevertheless had the effect Ron and Hermione had hoped. Though Harry had by far not forgotten about Black, he couldn't brood constantly on revenge when he wanted to help Hagrid win the case against the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. He, Ron, and Hermione went to the library the next day and returned to the empty common room laden with books which might help prepare a defense for Buckbeak. The three of them sat in front of the roaring fire, slowly turning the pages of dusty volumes about famous cases of marauding beasts, speaking occasionally when they ran across something relevant. Here's something. There was a case in 1722, but the hippogriff was convicted. Oh, look what they did to it. That's disgusting. This might help, look. A manticore savaged someone in 1296, and they let the manticore off. Oh no, that was only because everyone was too scared to go near it. Meanwhile, in the rest of the castle, the usual magnificent Christmas decorations had been put up, despite the fact that hardly any of the students remained to enjoy them. I love Christmas, and Christmas decorations, and Christmas lights, and all things Christmas. Thick streamers of holly and mistletoe were strung along the corridors. Mysterious lights shone from inside every suit of armor, and the great hall was filled with its usual 12 Christmas trees, glistening with glowing stars. A powerful and delicious smell of cooking pervaded the corridors, and by Christmas Eve it had grown so strong that even Scabbers poked his nose out of the shelter of Ron's pocket to sniff hopefully at the air. On Christmas morning, Harry was woken by Ron throwing his pillow at him. Oi! Presents! Harry reached for his glasses and put them on, squinting through the seeming darkness at the foot of his bed, where a small heap of parcels had appeared. Ron was already ripping the paper off his presents. Another jumper from Mum. Maroon. Again. See if you've got one. Harry had. Mrs. Weasley had sent him a scarlet jumper with the Gryffindor lion knitted on the front, 6 home-baked mince pies, some Christmas cake, and a box of nut brittle. Sounds delicious. As he moved all these things aside, he saw a long, thin package lying underneath. What's that? Said Ron, looking over, a freshly unwrapped pair of maroon socks in his hand. I dunno. Harry ripped the parcel open and gasped at the magnificent, gleaming broomstick that rolled out onto his bedspread. Ron dropped his socks and jumped off his bed for a closer look. I don't believe it, he said hoarsely. It was a firebolt, identical to the dream broom Harry had gone to see every day in Diagon Alley. Its handle glittered as he picked it up. He could feel it vibrating and let go. It hung in midair, unsupported, at exactly the right height for him to mount it. His eyes moved from the golden registration number at the top of the handle right down the perfectly smooth, streamlined birch twigs that made up the tail. "Who sent it to you?" said Ron in a hushed voice. "Look to see if there's a card," said Harry. Ron ripped apart the firebolt's wrapping. "Nothing! Blimey! Who'd have spent that much?" "Well," said Harry, feeling stunned, "I'm betting it wasn't the Dursleys." "I bet it was Dumbledore," said Ron, now walking round and round the firebolt, taking in every glorious inch. "He sent you the invisibility cloak anonymously." "That was my dad's, though," said Harry. "Dumbledore was just passing it to me. He wouldn't spend hundreds of galleons on me. He can't go giving students stuff like this." "That's why you wouldn't say it was from him," said Ron, "in case some git like Malfoy said it was favoritism." "Hey, Harry!" Ron gave a great whoop of laughter. "Malfoy! Wait till he sees you on this. He'll be sick as a pig. This is an international standard broom, this is." "I can't believe this," Harry muttered, running a hand along the firebolt while Ron sank into Harry's bed, laughing his head at the thought of Malfoy. "Who?" "I know," said Ron, controlling himself. "I know who it could have been. Lupin." "What?" said Harry, now starting to laugh with him. "Lupin? Listen, if he had that much gold, he'd buy himself some new robes." "Yeah, but he likes you," said Ron. "And he was away when your Nimbus got smashed, and he must have heard about it and decided to visit Diagon Alley and get this for you." "What do you mean he was away?" said Harry. "He was ill when I was playing in the match." "Well, he wasn't in the hospital wing," said Ron. "I was there, cleaning out the bedpans on the detention from Snape, remember?" Harry frowned at Ron. "I can't see Lupin affording something like this." "What are you two laughing about?" Hermione had just come in, wearing her dressing gown and carrying Crookshanks, who was looking very grumpy, with a string of tinsel tied around his neck. "Don't bring him in here," said Ron, hurriedly snatching Scabbers from the depths of his bed and stowing him in his pajama pocket. But Hermione wasn't listening. She dropped Crookshanks into Seamus's empty bed and stared open-mouthed at the firebolt. "Oh, Harry! Who sent you that?" "No idea," said Harry. "There wasn't a card or anything with it." To his great surprise, Hermione did not appear either excited or intrigued by this news. On the contrary, her face fell and she bit her lip. "What's the matter with you?" said Ron. "I dunno," said Hermione slowly, "but it's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, this is supposed to be quite a good broom, isn't it?" Ron sighed exasperatedly. "It's the best broom there is, Hermione," he said. "So it must have been very expensive. Probably cost more than all Slytherin's brooms put together," said Ron happily. "Well, who'd send Harry something as expensive as that and not even tell him they'd sent it?" said Hermione. "Who cares?" said Ron impatiently. "Listen, Harry, can I have a go on it? Can I?" "I don't think anyone should ride that broom just yet," said Hermione shrilly. Harry and Ron looked at her. "What do you think Harry's going to do with it? Sweep the floor?" said Ron. But before Hermione could answer, Crookshanks sprang from Seamus's bed right onto Ron's chest. "Get him out of here!" Ron bellowed as Crookshanks' claws ripped his pajamas and Scabbers attempted a wild escape over his shoulder. Ron seized Scabbers by the tail and aimed a misjudged kick at Crookshanks, which hit the trunk at the end of Harry's bed, knocking it over and causing Ron to hop on the spot, howling with pain. Vodka. It's just water. Oh. Crookshanks' fur suddenly stood on end. A shrill, tiny whistling was filling the room. The pocket sneakoscope had been dislodged from Uncle Vernon's old socks and was whirling and gleaming on the floor. I forgot about that, Harry said, bending down and picking up the sneakoscope. I never wear those socks if I can help it. The sneakoscope whirled and whistled in his palm. Crookshanks was hissing and spitting at it. I'm going through and waving at everybody who's watching, or was watching. You better take that cat out of here, Hermione, said Ron furiously. He was sitting on Harry's bed, nursing his toe. Can't you shut that thing up? He added to Harry, as Hermione strode out of the room, Crookshank's yellow eyes still fixed maliciously on Ron. Harry stuffed the sneakoscope back inside the socks and threw it back into his trunk. All that could be heard now was Ron's muffled moans of pain and rage. Scabbers was huddled in Ron's hand. It had been a while since Harry had seen him out of Ron's pocket. He was unpleasantly surprised to see that Scabbers, once so fat, was now very skinny. Patches of fur seemed to have fallen out, too. He's not looking too good, is he? Harry said. It's stress, says Ron. He'll be fine if that stupid great furball left him alone. And Harry, remembering what the woman at Magical Menagerie had said about rats only living 3 years, couldn't help feeling that unless Scabbers had powers which he'd never revealed, he was reaching the end of his life. And despite Ron's fervent complaints that Scabbers was both boring and useless, he was sure Ron would be very miserable if Scabbers died. Christmas spirit was definitely thin on the ground in the Gryffindor common room that morning. Hermione had shut Crookshanks in her dormitory, but was furious with Ron for trying to kick him. Ron was still fuming about Crookshanks' fresh attempt to eat Scabbers. Harry gave up trying to make them talk to each other and devoted himself to examining the firebolt, which he had brought down to the common room with him. For some reason, this seemed to annoy Hermione as well. She didn't say anything, but she kept looking darkly at the broom as though it too had been criticizing her cat. At lunchtime, they went down to the great hall to find that the house tables had been moved against the walls again, and that a single table, set for 12, stood in the middle of the room. Professor Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Sprout, and Flitwick were there, along with Filch, the caretaker, who had taken off his usual brown coat and was wearing a very old and rather mouldy-looking tailcoat. There were only 3 other students, 2 extremely-looking nervous first-years and a sullen-faced Slytherin fifth-year. "Merry Christmas," said Dumbledore as Harry, Ron, and Hermione approached the table. As there are so few of us, it seemed foolish to use the house tables. Sit down, sit down. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down side by side at the end of the table. "Crackers," said Dumbledore enthusiastically, offering the end of a large silver one to Snape, who took it reluctantly and tugged. With a bang like a gunshot, the cracker flew apart to reveal a large pointed witch hat topped with a stuffed vulture. Harry, remembering the boggart, caught Ron's eye, and they both grinned. Snape's mouth thinned, and he pushed the hat towards Dumbledore, who swapped it for his wizard's hat at once. "Tuck in," he advised the table, beaming around. As Harry was helping himself to roasted potatoes... potatoes. I haven't had potatoes in a while. The doors of the great hall opened again. It was Professor Trelawney, gliding towards them as though on wheels. She had put on a green sequin dress in honor of the occasion, making her look more than ever like a glittering, oversized dragonfly. "Sybil, this is a pleasant surprise," said Dumbledore, standing up. "I have been crystal gazing, Headmaster," said Professor Trelawney in her mistiest, most faraway voice. "And to my astonishment, I saw myself abandoning my solitary luncheon and coming to join you. Who am I to refuse the promptings of fate? I at once hastened from my tower, and I do beg you to forgive my lateness." "Certainly, certainly," said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. "Let me draw you up a chair." And he did indeed draw a chair in mid-air with his wand, which revolved for a few seconds before falling with a thud between Professor Snape and McGonagall. Professor Trelawney, however, did not sit down. Her enormous eyes had been roving along the table, and she suddenly uttered a kind of soft scream. "Oh, I do not dare, Headmaster. If I join the table, we shall be 13. Nothing can be more unlikely. Never forget that when 13 dine together, the first to rise will be the first to die." "We'll risk it, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall impatiently. "Do sit down. The turkey's getting stone cold." Professor Trelawney hesitated, and then lowered herself into the empty chair, eyes shut and mouth clenched tight, as though expecting a thunderbolt to hit the table. Professor McGonagall poked a large spoon into the nearest tureen. Tripe, Sybil? Professor Trelawney ignored her. Eyes open again, she looked around once more and said, "Where is dear Professor Lupin?" "I'm afraid the poor fellow is ill again," said Dumbledore, indicating that everybody should start serving themselves. "Most unfortunate that should happen on Christmas Day." "But surely you already know that, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall, her eyebrows raised. Professor Trelawney gave Professor McGonagall a very cold look. "Certainly I know, Minerva," she said. "But one does not parade the fact that one is all-knowing. I frequently act as though I'm not possessed of the inner eye, so as not to make others nervous." "That explains a great deal," said Professor McGonagall tartly. Professor Trelawney's voice suddenly became a good deal less misty. "If you must know, Minerva, I have seen that poor Professor Lupin will not be with us for very long. He seems aware himself that his time is short. He positively fled when I offered a crystal gaze for him." "Imagine that," said Professor McGonagall dryly. "I doubt," said Dumbledore in a cheerful but slightly raised voice, which put an end to Professor McGonagall and Professor Trelawney's conversation, "that Professor Lupin is in any immediate danger. Severus, you have made the potion for him again?" "I think that my allergy meds are wearing off. Oh my goodness. Foot, sleep. There we go." "Yes, Headmaster," said Snape. "Good," said Dumbledore. "Then he should be up and about in no time. Derek, have you had any of these chipolatas? They're excellent." The fifth-year boy went furiously red at being addressed directly by Dumbledore, but took the platter of sausages with trembling hands. Professor Trelawney behaved almost normally until the very end of Christmas dinner, 2 hours later. Full to bursting with Christmas dinner, and still wearing their cracker hats, Harry and Ron got up first from the table, and she shrieked loudly, "Me dears, which of you left your seats first? Which?" "I doubt it will make much difference," said Professor McGonagall coldly, "unless a mad axeman is waiting outside the doors to slaughter the first into the entrance hall." Even Ron laughed. Professor Trelawney looked highly affronted. "Coming?" Harry said to Hermione. "No," Hermione muttered. "I have a quick word with Professor McGonagall." "Oh, would you like to see Dumbledore in his vulture-topped hat?" Such a goofy man. "Come and untie the knots." Oh my, it's late. "Probably trying to see if she can take any more classes," yawned Ron as they made their way into the entrance hall, which was completely devoid of a mad axeman. When they reached the portrait hole, they found Sir Gadigan enjoying a Christmas party with a couple of monks, several previous headmasters at Hogwarts, and his fat pony. He pushed up his visor and toasted them with a flagon of mead. "Merry Christmas! Password?" "Scurvy cur," said Ron. "And the same to you, sir," roared Sir Gadigan as the portrait swung forward to admit them. Harry went straight up to the dormitory, collected his firebolt, the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his birthday, brought them downstairs, and tried to find something to do on the firebolt. However, there were no bent twigs to clip. The handle was so shiny already, it almost seemed pointless to polish it. He and Ron simply sat admiring it from every angle until the portrait hole opened, and Hermione came in, accompanied by Professor McGonagall. Although Professor McGonagall was head of Gryffindor House, Harry had only ever seen her in the common room once before, and that had been to make a very grave announcement. He and Ron stared at her, both holding the firebolt. Hermione walked around them, sat down, picked up the nearest book, and hid her face behind it. "So that's it, is it?" said Professor McGonagall beadily, walking over to the fireside and staring at the firebolt. "Miss Granger has just informed me that you've been sent this broomstick, Potter." Harry and Ron looked around at Hermione. They could see her forehead reddening over the top of her book, which was upside down. "May I?" said Professor McGonagall. but she didn't wait for an answer before pulling the firebolt out of their hands. She examined it carefully from handle to twig ends. And there was no note at all, Potter? No card? No message of any kind? No, said Harry blankly. I see, said Professor McGonagall. Well, I'm afraid I'll have to take this, Potter. What? Said Harry, scrambling to his feet. Why? It needs to be checked for jinxes, said Professor McGonagall. Of course, I'm no expert, but I dare say Madam Hooch and Professor Flitwick will strip it down. Strip it down? Repeated Ron, as though Professor McGonagall was mad. It shouldn't take more than a few weeks, said Professor McGonagall. You'll have it back when we're sure it's jinx-free. There's nothing wrong with it, said Harry, his voice shaking slightly. Honestly, Professor. You can't know that, Potter, said Professor McGonagall quite kindly. Not until you've flown it, at any rate. And I'm rather afraid that is out of the question until we are certain that it has not been tampered with. I shall keep you informed. Professor McGonagall turned on her heel and carried the firebolt out of the porthole, which closed behind her. Harry stood staring after her, the tin of high-finished polish still clutched in his hands. Ron, however, rounded on Hermione. What did you go running to McGonagall for? Hermione threw her book aside. She was still pink in the face, but stood up and faced Ron defiantly. Because I thought, and Professor McGonagall agrees with me, that broom was probably sent to Harry by Sirius Black. And tomorrow, we will read Chapter 12, The Patronus. Sadly, and for some stupid reason, there is no picture of the firebolt. All right, everybody, have a lovely evening. Bye, guys. Thank you for watching.